Welcome back, everyone. This is our first content class. So this week we're looking at animal sentience, and particularly its relationship to animal welfare, which is, there's a bunch of policy and law and internal policies within, say, scientific institutions about how you're allowed to treat various animals. You really don't have to do anything particular for the welfare of, say, houseflies. You can kind of do whatever you want to houseflies in a scientific laboratory. Flatworms, go nuts, chop them up, doesn't matter. But if you've got, say, simians in your lab or mice, now there's sort of rules. And one might hope that those rules are based on some sensible notion, right? There's some reason why the rules are the way they are. Some animals are protected and some animals get less or no protection. And a sensible way of doing that would be figuring out which animals are sentient. So the reading for this week was Animal Sentience by Browning and Birch. This paper is part of a larger sort of research project led by Jonathan Birch called the ASENT project, the Animal Sentience Project, trying to ground this question of like, okay, we got animal welfare laws. We want them to be grounded in the best available science about which animals need protection because they can actually suffer. And that was the project. It's like trying to get that science moved forward a bit. Okay. They don't spend a lot of time in this in the paper. I think it's reasonable to say that much of the policy around animal welfare and much of the kind of discussion in the reading for this week is founded on a utilitarian framework. So utilitarianism is a kind of moral framework. It's a moral theory, a theory about what's right and wrong. And I'm gonna compress this way down, unfairly down. If somebody's a committed utilitarian, I think they would find this level of compression of their ideas to be unfair. But for the purpose of this class, roughly we can say that utilitarianism is the idea that what matters ethically is suffering and happiness. There's a bunch of versions of this. Has anybody studied utilitarianism before? Heard about this in other classes? A smattering of you? Good. Can anybody tell me what this formulation leaves out? What are some of the complexities that I've smoothed over in this version of utilitarianism? Anyone? Something about rules, does that ring a bell? Rules and acts? Yeah.
Thing is, I don't think that it counts twice. I think other stuff is kind of going to
Yeah.
So, he was a little happy.
Right.
Skated with the watch and the first rhythms and spelling. By us, it was like, okay, this way to establish up to
Yes, happy. Yeah.
And after the but I really can praise tax.
Yeah, the trolley problem, yeah. Good, yes, you were the...
To be like, I guess that's the last one that they're related to.
Yeah, good. You're clearly recalling your lessons about utilitarianism. So questions like, basically you're talking about happiness and unhappiness points. The right thing to do is you measure the total number of happiness points, subtract the total number of sadness points, and if your action created more happiness points than sadness points, then that was a good thing to do. So if you kick a puppy in the face, but a whole bunch of people thought that was really funny, that might be morally good. That might be morally okay. If you save a bunch of people from starvation, that's probably also morally okay. It's just that. So this is contrasts, which was quite correctly said, usually with deontological ethics, where there are rules, like don't kick puppies in the face. I don't care how funny you think it is. Don't ever do that. Where there's no calculus of like how good was this versus how bad was this. Yeah.
Sorry, and I know this is a really pointed point, but just if you're saying people who then go on to do sad, sounds like that's morally wrong.
Good, yeah. So if you save a bunch of people from starvation, but they're all super depressed and suffer, that might end up being morally wrong. That is actually not that far from the point of the course. So we'll come back at the very end of the course to talk about astrobiology and this question of like, hey, should we seed life on other planets? Should we like fling bacteria to planets around distant stars? One of the arguments against that is a utilitarian argument that life is generally kind of crummy and hard, And actually, that's morally wrong because if life in total creates more, if the existence of life creates more unhappiness points than happiness points, then life shouldn't exist. Okay, so again, a serious and careful utilitarian would have a great deal to say to me right now about why I've oversimplified ways in which it's massaged and complexified and all that stuff. But I just thought I'd lay this out for the very, very roughest version of utilitarianism, which I think underlies, and you can see how this makes a good basic framework for doing like animal welfare policy. Like, look, you're some provincial policymaker, and you got to come up with something about how they transport pigeons from one place to another. You probably don't need to go way, way deeper than this to do your moral analysis. And what you want is to avoid suffering. The animal welfare laws are generally there just to sort of minimize suffering and increase happiness. Those are the kind of decisions we're actually dealing with here. Note what this conversation does not, what I just gave you, note what it does not mention at all. Many people, I find in especially university classrooms, many people, when we talk about animal welfare, the rights of animals or animal suffering, the thing that they go to is intelligence. What a surprise. A bunch of smart people think that being smart is what makes you important. This is very self-serving of us. I know we like to think that our smarts are what make us worthwhile or something like that. It doesn't mention the sort of skills or abilities these animals have. It doesn't mention their kind of internal complexity. None of that. So this is from Jeremy Bentham, generally regarded as the kind of the founding figure of utilitarianism. He says, the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but rather can they suffer? That's what matters. I make fun of the notion that intelligence is what matters. I think it's very tempting, because we live this. So one of the things that we very often, go.
If they don't assign work to societal something like that, do they assign a weight to animal suffering and human suffering?
Yeah.
Way.
Good. So is there some difference between human and animal suffering such that ours matters more? Utilitarianism is a very, very broad school, and a bunch of different answers within it. So you can imagine different answers to that question. You might say, no, actually, one sentient mind is one unit of happiness and suffering, and we shouldn't make any distinctions in there. There's a strain of this developed by Peter Singer that doesn't quite say that. That's the sort of most extreme version of this. But Peter Singer talks about, our essential bias towards Homo sapiens as being a kind of error, and a grievous moral error as well, because it lets us write off all kinds of suffering that doesn't matter. There are ways of thinking about utilitarianism where, so this is one of the ways that this massively oversimplifies it, is that there might be, more or less important types of happiness. You might eat a candy and go, yum, and that's a kind of happiness. Or you might witness the birth of your firstborn child and go, oh. And that might be a radically different type of happiness. And maybe contemplating the eternal forms of things is another type of happiness. Maybe successfully saving a life as a firefighter is another kind. And it might well be that humans have access to types of happiness that are, generally speaking, inaccessible to, say, a mosquito. So that might be, you might end up with a view that the mosquito is sentient, but it contains, in some sense, less sentience or lesser kinds of sentience or something like that. I don't want to presuppose the conclusion by sort of saying what all utilitarians would say. I think there's quite a lot of room within that framework to come up with different and interesting answers to that question. Yeah, good. Okay, so, but here's roughly where we are. If your moral framework is counting up happiness points and suffering points, then you don't really care whether the being who's suffering or the being who's happy is good at calculus or can quote Shakespeare. That's not relevant to this moral calculus, yeah? maybe that's a reason for you to reject this. Maybe like, no, smartness is the thing. And I'm going to come up with my own moral theory or my own animal welfare structure. But this is the conversation that we're in today. Yeah? Okay. Okay. So then that makes the central question, with that assumption in mind, that what we care about is minimizing suffering, maximizing happiness, well, that means anything with a point of view, with an experience of itself, is a moral patient, that is the subject of moral concern. That means the question is, what parts of the world are sentient? So, bunch of different definitions of this. We got one really broad one is just that there's something that it is like to be the thing. There is some point of view there. That if that strikes you as in desperate need of clarification, you just are correct about that. What exactly it means to have a point of view is a subject of enormous debate in psychology and philosophy. That is just a huge raging debate. Maybe we can narrow it down a little. We'll use a slightly stripped down notion of sentience that just sort of delivers the thing that we're interested in this moral question, which is sentience means that a creature is capable of positive or negative experiences like pain, fear, or joy. Maybe we want to just restrict it to that. Probably if there's something that it's like to be you, you're capable of pain, fear, joy, etc. But let's just focus on this narrower definition because it's less complicated and twisty and turny. Yeah? Okay. And that seems to have quite a lot to do with these moral questions because, imagine you build yourself a robot that does all of the pain and fear behaviors. You kick it and it cowers and looks sad, and you yell at it and it cries, or you praise it and it jumps around with joy. But because you built it, you know for sure that it doesn't have any inner experience. You know it's just acting out these behaviors. So it does all of the pain, fear, joy behavior, but you know for a fact because you built it that it doesn't internally have that. I propose that you don't need to feel super bad about that robot's life. Yeah? Like, if you're going around in video games killing NPCs, that's fine, right? Like, there's nothing morally deeply wrong on the utilitarian framework. Running around Skyrim hacking people to bits is fine, yeah? Because those things aren't suffering. They don't have suffering, they don't have joy. Those are inner states of being that you can't simply read off of something's behavior. Yeah? Okay. So this is how this sentience is connected to these moral questions. Let's try to peel a couple things apart though. Now let's try to recall this multiple choice question about pain and suffering. Let's try to peel those two things apart now. So, I think there's lots of examples of pain that people don't really care all that much about. You can be in pain but not suffer, let's say. So, they're not really sure how anesthetics work, which is a little disturbing. But your pain receptors they put you completely you're under general anesthetic, and then they open you up to do whatever they need to do. Those pain receptors are still firing on the skin. In some sense, your body is experiencing pain. But that doesn't mean that you should just forego the general anesthetic because it does prevent you from suffering. Similarly, you can imagine somebody having a positive feeling and no kind of overall reaction to it. You might feel pleasure, oh, that feels good, but you have no kind of overall response to it. So let's call pain the firing of these pain receptors, or kind of the physical sensations that tell you that your body is being damaged, but suffering is the overall organismal response to it. And it's suffering that you care about, right? It's suffering that matters morally. So, in the example of,
Does that mean we're not including like
mental pain or suffering?
Oh no, we definitely are. We definitely are. So suffering is the state of the overall organism, and mental pain is the state of your overall organism. I would say as well. Like, yeah. So I think mental suffering is one of the most common kinds we have. So we definitely need to include that as one of the things that we care about morally. Yeah. Sorry, did I see another hand? Yeah. Okay. So. In the very physical sense of anesthetic under surgery, what it does is keep those pain receptors firing from being integrated by your brain into the screaming panic of somebody opening up your sternum or whatever. Those signals do not get processed in the central way, and it's the processing in a central way that makes you suffer. And so this is why mental suffering, you're already there in the central problem. Mental suffering happens in the mental processor. The horrifying thing about mental suffering and mental illness in general is your body can be perfectly fine, well fed, well exercised, and all that stuff, but you're still completely gripped by the worst suffering possible. Here's a bit from this is not a new distinction by any stretch of the imagination. Here's one from the Buddhist suttas. So the Blessed One, that is the Buddha, said, "When touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed, run-of-the-mill person sorrows, grieves, laments, beats his breast, and becomes distraught. So he feels two pains, physical and mental. Just as to shoot a man with an arrow and right afterwards were to shoot him with another one, so that he could feel the pains of two arrows. In the same way, when touched with a feeling of pain, the uninstructed, run-of-the-mill person sorrows, grieves, laments, beats his breast, and becomes distraught. So he feels two pains, physical and mental." The point of on this view, the point of Buddhist training, becoming a Buddhist monk, and undergoing decades of mental training, is to no longer have the suffering when you feel pain. You feel a lot of pain, but you don't suffer because of it. Yeah. Right. Okay. Yeah.
A definition of suffering that I've come across recently was said that, states that suffering is just a feeling that you don't want to feel. And in that framework, I would argue that some pain is probably fine.
Yeah.
But like other emotions, such as, like for animals, it's hard to quantify, but jealousy, greed could also lead to some sort of suffering.
Yeah.
Is that worth considering for animals? And does the question of animal intelligence become more important?
Interesting. Yeah. So this richer notion of suffering might, if you didn't hear that, this one way of talking about suffering is just a feeling that you don't want to feel. A feeling that you are sort of like your overall picture of yourself is experienced negatively, and you might, I don't know, if you exercise or jog, you might be feeling the burn is sort of like, oh yes, this is good. I'm glad that I'm feeling the burn because that's what I was going for in my workout today. So then this raises the question of things like jealousy, greed, hate. Those are the kind of things that, for example, the Buddha would tell you are the kind of deep sources or centers of suffering in your life. And then that might make animal intelligence relevant because, it takes a certain amount, jealousy takes a certain amount of awareness of the world around you. I don't think mosquitoes feel jealousy. I suspect not. Paramecia probably don't have jealousy. Cats definitely do. 100% cats do. Yeah, so that's good. So that might be one of the ways in which the question of intelligence does feed into even the utilitarian picture of things, because intelligence, this is odd to say in an institution of higher learning, but intelligence actually makes you much susceptible to new and more terrifying forms of suffering. You can suffer on a fully intellectual level. It's great. I actually think that any expansion of consciousness, this is Jung actually, any expansion of consciousness comes with suffering, because the more you get the world, the more you can get that it's going wrong for you. That seems to be just kind of the deal. you might use that as a way of rejecting, for example, a utilitarian calculus for thinking about what a good life is. It might be that suffering and happiness aren't the point of it all, that there's something more. But yeah. Okay. Whew, that was a tangent. All right. Okay. So, have we got the idea of pain and suffering? Pain is the sort of purely physical, sense receptors going off. Suffering is this state of the whole organism. Your notion of yourself as being in somehow a negative state. Yeah? And then sentience is just the ability to have suffering, essentially. Again, I'm not making sentience sound like a very good deal, but there's an opposite to it, which is happiness. You also have the capacity to have deep and complex forms of happiness. Okay, so then that leaves us with this question. So we've got this connection between what's right and good and sentience, because sentience is what means you can suffer or be happy, and in utilitarianism, that's what we care about. Then that means we need to figure out what animals are sentient. What animals are capable of suffering? Okay, and then where do you even? Okay, so here's an advertisement for philosophy in general. This is one of those questions that you look at and you go, how do you even begin to ask that question? Is that even a reasonable question to ask? What the heck kind of question is that? And when you find yourself asking those things, you have now entered the realm of philosophy. We deal with those questions that are so ill-structured, so poorly formulated, that you don't even know where to look for what an answer would look like or where to look for the evidence for it. That's our stock and trade. That's what we do. The just ugly as sin questions. And then we sort of try to hammer away at them for a couple centuries until they turn into something where you know what kind of evidence would be relevant, and then it gets to be a science, and we sort of move on to something twistier and nastier as a question. So how would you start on this? What would you look for if I instruct, this class is now a government committee. We're going to figure out which animals are sentient. What evidence do you go look for? Yeah.
Which animals do process pain?
Right, so processing pain is good, but remember that it's suffering that we care about. So suffering and pain might be a necessary condition, but it's probably not going to be sufficient. But that's good. That's a good start. Yeah.
I think a slight added to that response.
Yeah.
I would look at which animals can learn to avoid.
Right.
For example, if you have a rat in a tube and you inflict pain on that rat somehow using a particular device, will the rat learn to avoid that device? In that case, it might be indicated that the rat can understand suffering.
Good. So it's not just that they can experience pain, but they have a response to it. Yeah.
I might see how different animals, different species react to certain stimuli.
Yep.
Or even hormones that could be in that can then see what happens.
Right. So you do some experiments. This is one of the and they do that in this study that we'll talk about. One of the tricks is that you got to do these weird experiments on a bunch of animals that you're pretty sure are sentient. It's a bit, one of the catch-22s of this stuff is that you got to do some weird stuff. You're probably going to have to do some weird stuff to animals that you got like some reason to believe might be sad about that. Sorry, so a bunch of other hands. Who else? Yeah.
Maybe if you can show the animal at their animal of its own species, and there's some sort of an intellectual response like that, rather than it being just based the pain receptors, which should be kind of an instinctual response.
Interesting. So yeah, you beat up a mouse in front of a couple of other mice and see what they do, because that means they have some picture of not just that there is pain, but that there is, and this integrates the suggestion that there'd be something about the avoidance of pain, that they're going to try to stop the pain, and somebody else shows that they have a kind of representation of it in some way. That's interesting. Sorry, I saw a hand up here first.
This is kind of the building up what people previously said, but the response I think should be the negative response. So I was thinking like to the crab, I've never seen like a crab like cry or something like that. If they attack you does.
Yeah.
Any pain that I guess it evokes a negative response.
Right. So some pain avoidance particularly. Yeah, good.
even to add on to that, are things to like protect itself from pain. Like if
Yeah.
it's only being inflicted on a certain part of the body, protect itself.
Good. Yeah.
I know that for some depression studies, mice, there's like swim tests.
Yeah. God.
How long they're like,
Well,
want to stay afloat.
yep.
That varies after being exposed to like some sort of negative stimuli, how that would change if they got some sort of like pain reliever
Yep.
or things like that.
Yep. The swim test. Yeah. Watch the swim. Have you heard of this? The swim test. You put a mouse in a glass of water that's half full. It's too high for them to climb up, and they just have to sort of tread water. And then you watch how long it takes for them to give up and sink. No, I think they generally don't die. They generally rescue. Once they give up, they rescue them out of there. It's still awful. I'll just tell you this because I can't get it out of my head. So now I'm going to inflict it on you as well. I recently read a little article about hope, which was they did a swim test on some mice, and just before they were going to sink, they pulled them out. And they go for 15 minutes or something like this before they start to sink. But if you take ones that had been in the past had been rescued just before they sink, they'll swim for like 24 hours, 60 hours or something like this. The amount of trying that they will do is wildly increased if they have some feeling that they might get rescued. Tells you something about hope. This is the saddest. I'm sorry, I told you this was awful. I have to inflict it on you too. The utilitarians would say I shouldn't, but I did. So yeah.
I would feel the example you just mentioned is probably a better way of quantifying whether that pain equals suffering, because pain in general is an evolutionary mechanism, and every organism that has pain receptors would probably do something to avoid that.
Yeah.
Results with the pain receptor that they're for.
Right.
That's not an appropriate way to quantify whether the heat suffering, just avoidance of pain.
Good. So let's look at the ASENT project criteria. I think it nicely integrates a bunch of this stuff and also goes a little bit beyond just avoiding suffering. So okay, so this is a great big published study review of the evidence of sentience in cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans. Roughly, that's lobsters and crabs, amongst a bunch of other species, but. And they come up with these 8 criteria, and we'll go through these in some detail. But more or less, they're split into more or less 2 types. There are kind of neurobiological, so look at what kind of biological substrate is the animal using to process its world, and then also looking at behavior. And there's quite a bit of overlap in the neurobiological and the behavioral. None of these this isn't it's not like a checklist, like you have to have all 8 or you're not sentient. It's kind of like on each of these you get a rating as a species, and the higher you have as of ratings in total, the higher your like sentience grade is, something like that. So you can totally fail one of these and still be regarded as probably sentient, but you're supposed to have as many of them as you can, to as great a degree as you can. So, okay, let's go through these more closely. So, the first 3 are purely neurological ones. Possession of nociceptors, which is pain receptors, nerves that respond to damage, noxious substances, that kind of thing. So you got some nerves that detect pain. So good, I think we said that one. Possession of integrative brain regions, where signals from those nociceptors get collected up with all of the other signals from all of the other sensory surfaces on the body, and then connections between the nociceptors and integrative brain regions. It can't just be that there are nociceptors and there is a brain. Those 2 things have to be hooked up. Yeah? Okay, so you've got the capacity to experience pain, and you've got the capacity, the neurons that do that are somehow wired into a central processing unit. Yeah, yeah.
Are there ever instances where those receptors are not wired to the processing unit?
I believe so. I believe so. Well, there's instances where there is no central unit.
So then what's the terminus receptor?
Well, lots of animals do a kind of distributed processing. So they don't have lots of animals don't have a central nervous system, or lots of living things don't have a central nervous system. Plants have nociceptors is a neurological term, but they've got things that detect damage. But they don't have a brain, they don't have a central nervous system at all. So you can have local responses. You could have, for example, a nociceptor that just triggers an immune response. So like, there's one of the things your nociceptors do. You've got damaged skin. All right, well, I'm going to release a bunch of white blood cells to the area, do inflammation, that kind of thing. So local responses like that are one use of them that doesn't involve an integrative brain region. Yeah.
Do plants have something like that?
Something like that. They've got ways of detecting damage. The smell of grass, freshly cut grass, is actually a pain signal. It's sending a big signal that it's been damaged to the rest of the world. So it's the smell of screaming grass in the morning. Yeah.
I don't let this certain plant need to be spicy. Would that be also an example of evolving to the end of a
Yeah. Let's come back to plants when we do plants. So they're evolved to discourage grazing animals from eating them. I didn't actually hear the end of the question.
Would that be an example of them evolving to kind of resist pain, resist food?
Yeah, sort. I mean, yeah, but it wouldn't count as sentience on this. Okay, so that's actually an interesting example. So. You've got plants, they produce capsaicin or caffeine or something like this, and that's meant to put grazing animals off of eating them. Now that doesn't involve any of these neurological criteria. One of the reasons why it can't, because they don't have integrative brain regions. I think this is a planarian. It's some kind of worm. What's the worm that we map the whole neural system of? They got like 105 neurons in their whole body. And we map the whole thing. C. elegans. I think it's C. elegans. So C. elegans is an example. It's this little worm guy. They got neurons. They got pain receptors, but they have no brain where all of those neurons kind of like, your neural system in humans is all sort of mostly pointed at your brain. There's some stuff in your stomach. But there's a real sort of central processing area for us, and they don't have C. elegans doesn't have that. So, and then think back to our distinction between pain and suffering. Why does it matter whether they're integrative brain regions? Yeah.
Just because it can help you go, suffering.
Right, exactly. And we said suffering is a state of the overall organism. Suffering, whether you're suffering or not, depends on your goals and your interests and the state of all your other systems. My leg hurting might mean something vastly different if I'm doing leg presses versus if I just fell. Those are the, you might have the same amount of pain, but one is suffering and one is like, yeah, I'm doing it. So suffering, you need to know everything. You need to know the overall state of the living thing to tell whether it's suffering or not. And to know whether I'm suffering or not, I need to have somewhere that integrates a picture of how I'm doing as an overall, how my life is going, what my goals are, what my interests are, what I'm trying to do, where I'm at. All of those are relevant to determining whether something is suffering to me. And if you don't have a central brain region, the suggestion here is there's nowhere for you to put that picture together. Therefore, nothing can frustrate your life goals if you don't have a brain to have a goal in, kind of thing. That's the suggestion. Okay. The other thing that they're trying to avoid with talking about integrative brain region is just having, you don't want to say suffering is just, diagnose suffering just based on reflexes. So you can, I mean, you can have, you can suffer based on a reflex, of course, but what they want is something more complex behavior to diagnose sentience, because, you know, like a dead animal can have some reflexes. You can, if you like, you can push electricity through the limbs of a dead animal and they'll still respond, that kind of thing. So if it can be dead and still have a reflex, that's clearly, that shows that reflexes cannot be sufficient for suffering. Okay, so we are going through these criteria of sentience. Recall that none of these are necessary. You can utterly fail to have one or two of these things and still be considered. It's like a spectrum. You're somewhere on the sentience spectrum. The more of these you have, and to a greater degree, the more points you score to be on the sentience spectrum, and then we get to give a crap about your life, I guess. That's the deal. Okay. So we got through 1, 2, 3. You got to have something like pain receptors. Those pain receptors have got to be hooked up to something like a brain, something that integrates your overall nervous system. So now we're on to 4, and this gets to some of the stuff that we sort of like brainstormed in terms of, you know, if we were coming up with criteria, what would we say? I think this was mentioned, something like this. You know, this is pain avoidance. So responses are affected by potential local anesthetics and analgesics. That is, if you give them Tylenol or some morphine, they behave differently. So the behavior is related in some way. So we moved on to now behavioral criteria. If you give them some pain reliever, you can see a difference in their behavior, which means that their behavior was a response to the pain. This is slightly altered from Smith and Boyd, 1991. This is just a philosophy paper back then, not a kind of like policy paper, but they talked about receptors for opioid substances found in the central nervous system, especially the brain. If you got we've all got opioid receptors in our brains, which is a way that your body modulates its own level of responsiveness to pain. And if you see that kind of receptor in the brain, maybe that's evidence that this animal has differential responses to pain, that they sometimes experience pain and respond one way, and sometimes experience pain and respond another. The ASENT project modifies this because not all species have opioid receptors. That's something that we mammals have, but like not all species have them. But there might be other chemicals that play that same basic role in their physiology. So if you can give them a pain reliever, that means that pain reliever is attaching to some internal receptor that has something to do with regulating its response to pain. Think back to the one about reflexes. So if there's some internal dial that regulates responses to pain, that means that they're not pure reflexes. They're not just a mechanical response to pain, but actually are in some sense integrated into its overall picture of itself and how things are going. Okay, I'll just close this.
Wow, thanks.
Right. Okay, and here's where, so we talked about, when we were brainstorming this stuff, we talked about, you know, they try to avoid pain, and so this integrates that and also takes it a little bit further. So to try to integrate the avoidance of pain with this central processing of how you're doing as an organism. Motivational trade-offs that show balancing of threat against opportunity for reward. So apparently, if you little hermit crabs that live in these shells, and they trade as they grow, they trade shells. So it's not like they're physically attached to the shell, but sometimes they really like a shell. Sometimes the shell fits just right. And if you give a hermit shell, a crab, a shell that it really likes, and then give it little electric shocks to try to like motivate it to come out of its shell, it will sometimes come out. But the more it likes its shell, the more resistant it is to leaving. Like, screw you, I'm not leaving. I love this shell. I don't care if you shock my butt. I'm staying in my shell. So what that shows is, so they're responding to the pain, but they are responding in a way that's modulated by something and it's, in terms of your sensory world, the shape of your home is something that's not going to be kind of front of mind, super salient, right? It's a bit of a background condition to your experience, but it is nonetheless your overall picture of how you're doing in life. I got a nice shell, I like this shell, I get that I'm being zapped on the butt, but I don't want to leave this shell. And this is where what you're seeing is kind of the behavioral equivalent of that central processing. Its understanding of how nice a shell it has is being compared against how big of an electric shock it's being given, and it responds in a way that integrates those two things. Yeah? And this is why if you're working out and you're in pain, you might not be suffering, because you're saying, look, this is there's an amount of pain that you would no doubt begin to suffer from. Like, okay, I've broken both of my knees, it's probably trying to take a break. But in lots of cases, you say, no, this is an appropriate and reasonable amount of suffering given the context. Or, sorry, an appropriate and reasonable amount of pain given the context. And then at some point you tip over into suffering. It's never mind, I'm gonna go play video games instead. Okay, so motivational trade-offs. Similarly, flexible self-protective behavior in response to injury and threat. So it's not just avoidance. So we'll see when we talk about plants in a couple of weeks. There are plants that respond to threat. The Mimosa pudica it's called sensitive plant. So these delicate little leaves, and if you touch them, they fold up. It's kind of cool. Plants have a variety of chemical responses to damage to try to stop the damage, but they're not super flexible. They're not super flexible. They don't have a variety of responses and they pick the most interesting one, or they pick the relevant one from a list. Yeah, come on, you're welcome to. Do you want to learn about animal suffering? Okay. And I think it's. So this is again, when we were coming up with criteria, it was a lot of like, okay, they need to try to be avoiding pain, and that makes sense. And is there another class? Okay, all right. They need to be trying to avoid pain, and that makes sense. But they need to be doing it in a flexible way so that we can tell that it's not just sort of a chemical program being acted out. That's what makes it. It's not what makes it relevant to their morals, whether they're having a good time or not. Like if you put somebody's hand on a hot stove, they'll yank it back, and they'll yank it back before the signal even gets to their brain. It gets to the spine, and the spine sends a very, very inflexible, like, get your hand out of there signal. And that's doing something terrible. Putting their hand on a hot stove is a terrible thing to do to somebody. It's relevant, it's morally relevant, but it's not by itself evidence of sentience. So keep in mind what we're doing. We're not doing criteria for like what matters. These are diagnostics for sentience. So just having reflexes doesn't count as flexible self-protective behavior. It's self-protective behavior, but it's got to be something that gives us evidence that this is, integrated in some holistic way of your overall picture of your life for it to be relevant to suffering and happiness. Okay. Associative learning that goes beyond habituation and sensitization. This is one of the ones that we'll talk about when we come back to plants. So the Mimosa pudica, the sensitive plant, it's got this self-protective behavior. You touch it and its leaves curl up. But if you wait until they uncurl and immediately touch it again, and then wait until they uncurl and then immediately touch it again, and do that all day, eventually it will stop responding. It becomes desensitized to that. Like, oh, I'm not actually getting damaged. Fine, I'm not going to spend the energy to curl up again. So habituation is just when a stimuli, the response to the stimuli decreases over time. I just gave you an example of habituation. Sensitization is when your response increases over time. And those are pretty simple forms of learning. You can see those forms of learning pretty much in every living thing. They're not evidence of sentience, at least. So associative learning is kind of making novel connections between previously unrelated stimuli. Pavlov's dog is doing associative learning because, you give the food and he drools, every time you give them food, you ring a bell, and then the ringing the bell is enough to make them drool. That's nothing in that dog's sort of genetic program encodes the relationship between bells and food. That's not something that was built in. It's not mechanical. It had to have a kind of at least adaptive picture of something in its brain has to be updating its model of how various sensory modalities are related to each other. So it's again a kind of integrated picture of the world. Yeah, yeah.
I think how this relates to like a certain crabs in their Indians on their shells. Obviously that's an instinct that they have, but how did that come about? Because they've learned to have shells as their homes, as opposed to being
So, good. So this, to relate those two, you might say that the number 5 is, you can imagine number 5 being the result of, well, they're both sort of the result of genetics. I don't know. Like, the hermit crab's preference for certain types of shells might not be learned, it might be innate. It might come programmed with senses of like what makes a good shell, what does a good shell feel like. So that wouldn't be brought about by associative learning. Some of that stuff is just programmed in. My preference for having enough oxygen and not too much CO2, I'm just born like this. And nobody had to teach me that breathing is important. I just got it right off the bat. So that's not associative learning in that sense, but you might see a motivational trade-off. Like I might be willing to hold my breath for some reason and experience discomfort. So associative learning is supposed to be stuff that it's not hardwired biologically. But it is bringing together two different sense modalities in terms of some overall picture of the world. That kind of thing. Yeah? Yeah.
With the hermit crab just be like associating the great shell with what protects them, what lasts the longest, and then never in that.
It could be. It quite could be. I do not know enough about hermit crab learning to answer off the top of my head which of those two, but just trying to conceptually pull these two apart. I have to admit, these later criteria, I'm sometimes not super clear on the difference between them. They seem to blur together. So I will not ask you on the test distinguish what makes 7 and 8 different. There seem to be considerable overlap. In some ways, they seem to be getting at the same thing from different ways of phrasing it or different approaches. Is that maybe I'm missing crucial distinctions here. One of the differences between a policy paper and a philosophy paper, this was written for lawmakers, and they don't spend 20 pages defending each one of these. A philosopher would have gone to absolute bottom of they would have started from Descartes and just worked their way all the way up. They would have argued for every single one of them and done a long thing. They don't do that in this paper. They just say, here's what we came up with. So we're sort of left to infer why exactly these are the 8 and why they're the phrase the way they are. So if you see connections here or overlap here, that's just probably correct. That's probably just a correct assessment of what's going on. I think that they all kind of converge on the same thing, which is trying to diagnose the capacity for suffering and happiness in our sense, or something like that. So this one, they give us a little bit. They say they don't think habituation and sensitization are good criteria because you see those responses in organisms with no central nervous system. So a jellyfish is a nice example of an organism with no central nervous system. There's no brain in a jellyfish. There's just a bunch of parts.
For associative learning to be a thing and for organisms to organize behaviors around associative learning, does that need to have some memory and what caused them pain in the past?
Well, yeah, they have to have some form of memory. Yeah, they have to have some form of memory. They don't necessarily have to have explicit episodic memory, but they do have to be storing some residue of their sense experience. Yeah. Good. So jellyfish show habituation and sensitization. They have no nervous system, so no central nervous system, so we're pretty sure they're not building up a centralized picture of what their life is like. Yeah.
Alright, so I know you said they don't really explain the reason behind all of this, but feels as though they're using one of their past traditions to dictate other, and it feels as though they should be independent of each other if we're not using it as a checklist, but instead like a series of criteria that we can. That.
It does make sense. So when you're doing like a personality test, you want the different items to be sort of like distinct from each other enough so that each is diagnostic.
They're almost like exposing the answer before they fit.
Right. It sort of stacks the deck. That's worrying if it's not all one thing that they're getting at. So if all of these ultimately point at one metric, level of sentience, then it's okay for there to be overlap. It would be maybe ideal for them to be fully separable, but they didn't, for example, go around and make sure that there was a species that has associative learning but not flexible self-protective behaviors. That's not, if you're doing like a psych test, that's the kind of thing that you want. They didn't try to do that. Partly the problem is what they rail against is that for almost all the species in the world, we don't really have data on how they fit these criteria. People haven't been going out and being like, okay, the hermit crab gets mad when you try to get it out of its shell. What about ants? What about peacocks? What about so on and so? We haven't gone out and like systematically tested this stuff. So yeah. Okay. So yeah, they're working with less data than you might want. Behavior that shows the animals value local anesthetics or analgesics when injured. Boy, if you're worried about overlap, this is, we had this just a few criteria ago. So this is in some sense integrating this issue of flexible behavioral strategies for avoiding pain with the notion that they should respond to pain relievers. This is kind of just the two of them put together. In a perfect world, they would all be perfectly clear and separate, and they'd write me long screeds about why they chose each of them, and I would read them and pick them apart. But that's not what we got. So, okay. Any questions about anything? So those are our 8. I promise I don't expect you to memorize them or anything. I want you to have the gist of this. People seeing how these seem to be saying the same thing is a very good sign, because I do think that these sort of aim at the same basic question. Number 1 through 3 from a neurological point of view, 4 through 8 from a behavioral point of view. Basically, have you got a world? The question is, have you got a world that you care about? And that's the sense of sentience that we care about here. Have you got a world that you care about? And that the way you diagnose that is, first of all, have you got somewhere in your physiology to put together a picture of the world? And second of all, do you behave in ways that show you care about your worlds? That seems to be it. Okay, so questions about any of that? All right, so let's see the report card. Who passes the test? This is not a pass-fail. This is a very much like by degrees kind of thing. VH is very high, so they get a very high rating on a criterion. H is high, L is low, M is medium, V is VL. So there's not really like pass-fail here. But octopods, like octopuses, get very high on a bunch of them. They get nothing less than a medium. Their conclusion is octopi are pretty sentient. They're pretty sentient. Yeah, I'll leave you to go through this. There's nobody here who gets just low on everything. Nautiloids don't do great, but like these are the species that they looked at specifically, and like they're finding a lot of evidence of sentience in animals that don't, generally speaking, get animal welfare protection. There's not much for, if you're a lobster, there ain't much for you.
Speckling.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah.
How did the, well, I don't know if you've been,
Yeah.
how did the true grads get very high for glycoid, or which is receptors for opioid substances, but very low for number 8, which is, so will they value it?
So quite possibly they just didn't find, so the other thing that they clarify, these ratings are not ratings of the objective presence of these things. They are ratings of the amount of evidence that we have for these things. So you can have excellent evidence. You just look at their neuroanatomy and say, yes, there are receptors for analgesics here, but if nobody's done the test to see whether they behaviorally respond. So this is it. You'd have to. This is one of the reasons why there's very little data for so many of these species. You got to set up a test with a bunch of crabs and see how they respond to aspirin or whatever. And that's not a cheap or easy test to do. You need a behavioral psychologist in there to tell you how to do it. You need hundreds of crabs. If it's a species that's hard to keep in captivity, it's almost going to be impossible. So these are yeah. Sorry. Thank you. That's a very helpful clarification that I should have made. These are ratings of how much evidence we have for these things, not given the evidence we have, here's how we think it is, which are slightly different. Yeah.
Some of scroll warning stuff, but evidence of certain gut receptors and Goal 8 measures their style.
Right. So I believe so. Response is affected by potential local anesthetics or analgesics, but 8 is that they're in some sense that integrates the flexibility of behavior with the response. So like if you give maybe if you give a crab a bunch of heroin, it gets real floppy and relaxed. But it doesn't say respond to offers for heroin. It isn't motivated by heroin, or it doesn't. I think the example here was done on octopi, and it was, you put a little vinegar in the tank, and they're like, oh, gross, and they would avoid that area of the tank for a while. But if you give them a pain reliever, then they won't be as avoidant of that area. So they've got a picture of where the hurt happened. They avoid it unless there is an analgesic present. I guess this is sort of like their choices about where to go are mediated by it. That's how I understand the distinction. Yeah. Okay. So. That was decapods and crustaceans. In our actual reading, the Browning and Birch paper, they report the evidence for sentience in insects is, and I quote, mixed. They give this Eisman quote, insects will continue normal feeding and mating behaviors even when severely injured. I came across this from a Heidegger paper, Fundamental Concepts of Metaphysics, where he argues that the animals are poor of world. So for Heidegger, the idea of having a world is really crucial, and he wants to show that animals don't have a world the way we do. And his example is if you apparently cut the abdomen of a bee and give it a bunch of honey or something, it'll keep eating and eating while the honey flows out the incision, and it never goes, oh, I'm not getting full, I'm giving up. Its responses are in some sense programmed. That's his example. I don't know. The insects seem to be, in general, insects is a huge category. The evidence that we have for them, the Browning and Birch report, they don't show this kind of behavioral flexibility that you would want to see to diagnose sentience. So maybe you don't have to feel bad about squatting mosquitoes? Maybe? I don't know. Okay. They talk a little bit about some of the arguments that have been Browning. Back to Browning and Birch, our sort of like overall summary article. They want to respond to this paper, and this gets us into responding to this paper gets us into some complexities that I want to get to. So we'll talk about it. They talk about the Key 2016 argues that fish probably don't feel pain. The argument the Key gives goes like this. We know pretty much where humans process pain in our brains. So if you there are lots of studies where you like put somebody on mild discomfort or pain and watch what happens, where their brain lights up, and it's largely in the neocortex. Seems like the neocortex is the thing in humans that got like radically bigger over the last couple million years. This weird evolutionary event where our brains like exploded. But other mammals like mice have neocortexes as well, not as dramatic as ours, but they also have them. So humans process pain in the neocortex, other animals process pain in the neocortex. Fish do not have a neocortex. Therefore, fish likely do not feel pain. I can see you're all completely convinced. Yes?
So in the reading, the example that I gave, I guess this was a robot which you programmed to feel pain.
Yeah.
Would not share the same structure.
Yeah.
It would experience pain. Is it possible that fish are similar, but they
Yeah.
have the same brain, so it's probably so straight.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, he cheated by doing the readings ahead of time. So the response to this is what's called multiple realizability. Pain is realized, processing of pain is realized in humans by our neocortexes. That's where we do it. But who's to say that it couldn't be processed in many different ways? Why couldn't there be different structures that process pain? I mean, I strongly suspect that there's other intelligent life in the universe. It's a great big universe. I'd be surprised if we were the only ones. I'd also be very surprised if their physiology was like us, which means they would experience pain with very different neuroanatomy than we have. I don't see any principal reason why a computer couldn't be fully sentient. Not the computers we have, but like there's using electricity moving through silicon. I don't see any reason why that couldn't be silicon or sentient. We just saw this argument here. Octopi get really high ratings on likelihood of sentience, but they're wildly different than us neuroanatomically. They're wildly different than us. Most of their neurons are in their arms. Last common ancestor, something like 500 million years ago. These are not our close cousins. But like on all of the behavioral metrics, they act sentient for as far as anyone can tell. They look pretty sentient. Intelligence, and they're also good problem solvers. So, sorry, this is the analogy I'm trying to make. Intelligence is clearly multiply realizable because octopi are pretty intelligent. They can solve problems. They can do a bunch of stuff. It's obviously multiply realizable. We know that. The tests for intelligence are easier to do than tests for sentience. So why not sentience? Why couldn't sentience likewise be multiply realizable? Why couldn't the processing of pain be have a bunch of different neurological substrates? Sound good? Any worries or objections there? Yeah? Yeah. Or anything else?
I'm just wondering, how is it possible that you can be intelligent without sentient?
Oh, I think many machines are intelligent without sentience. Let's say depends how you define intelligence. Let's say intelligence is the ability to solve a problem given a clear problem formulation and which moves you're allowed to make to solve it. I think machines are vastly more intelligent than us in many ways, but probably not sentience. Yeah.
Blue side, it said feel pain. Is that the same thing as suffering?
Right. So this is part of the problem of the terminology around this because no two people use the words the same way in this debate. Herding cats to get people to talk the same. Feel pain here means suffer from pain, but Key uses the word feel. He uses feel pain. That's the equivalent for us of suffering. So, yeah. I'm sorry that we're like this. It would be nice if everybody talked in the same way, but we don't. So, okay. So happy with okay. Are we happy with this as a refutation of the no cortex, no cry argument? Also, it's a terrible name. Anyway, okay, doesn't matter. Okay, but that lands us in a horrible mess, intellectually, morally. Now we got to deal with this. So, single-celled organisms. This is a paramecium. This is one cell. It does stuff like avoid noxious substances and other dangers, and it swims away from poison and towards food. In humans, we would perfectly happily treat that as evidence that they are awake and feeling stuff. Do we have to say single-celled organisms are sentient now? Because you can say, oh, well, it doesn't look like us. But that was the whole the multiple realizability argument, is it doesn't have to look like us. That's not a criterion for us anymore. No. Yeah.
I guess I
Oh, sorry.
I think they'll be very fun.
Yeah. Why don't you? Yeah.
Yeah, so I guess I'm just wonder, I would copy with, we would see if we would interpret this as feelings in human, because, like, it can perfectly well imagine someone who's sleepwalking,
Yep.
you know, is going to go there, cook the fish, and
Sure.
avoids the, I don't know,
Good.
painful hot pan on the stove while they're doing that,
Yep.
and, like, you're not doing that any form of conscious.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Okay. So good. Good. The mere existence of these things avoiding some things and moving towards other things is not evidence of them being sentient. I agree. But if we're willing to say sentience is multiply realizable, it really does put the burden of evidence proof on us of saying why a paramecium couldn't realize it. Why? What disqualifies this? Or just to go back to the criteria, what disqualifies anything without nerves? Do you need a nervous system to be sentient? Why? If you're going to do this like, oh, multiple realizability, so fish probably can have sentience, why can't you do the same thing for example, plants? Really, nerves are the thing. That's your kind of like stopping point, or brains. Why does it have to have a brain to be sentient? Maybe an integrated world model is likewise multiply realizable. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, sorry, but you didn't get your chance to talk.
So these, I would say there's something is like,
Yeah.
kind of, oh, the thing about your large class.
Yeah.
I would warn what the rich thing.
Right. Right.
Trying to get ones that I actually don't fund before.
Okay.
It's like at that point, the asymmetric range was kind of like the
Swedish indeed.
Yeah.
I feel like kind of, and the thing is, when I listen to nonsense, there's also some survey, also realizing it goes into it. But I could like also interpret that as complex situation as opposed to like this is info. You have this to separate.
Yeah. 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 Good. Okay. Sorry. And yeah, Nick.
If we're relating this back to the purpose of why we do this in the policy, right?
Yeah.
So when we're talking about a single cell organism, I don't think that would really matter too much in terms of policy, because it's not like we can tell that these things exist just by looking at a room, right?
Yeah. So there's no practical policy you can enact that the Paramecium Protection Act, that's not a thing that we could reasonably, that would mean no hand sanitizer, that would mean no antibiotics, you don't get to have a bunch of, yeah, there's no realistic scenario where in the 21st century we start recognizing the sentience of paramecia. We'll see next week the Janes do treat single-celled, like very microscopic organisms as, they try to treat them as morally important, not necessarily as important as other living things, but like as morally important. You could go there. You could say there are people in the bioethics literature that say it's called biocentrism, and they say, look, no, forget about, for them, sentience isn't even a factor. They say, no, all life is equally valuable. One life is as valuable as any other life across species. Doesn't matter. It's a thing people think. I'm not sure I agree with that, but if you want to reject it, then we should think about why. We should think through our reasons why. If I'm like, no, I care a lot of, fine, I'll care about the cats and the dogs and the lobsters, but I'm not going to care about Paramecia. It's good to think through why. And don't just tell me it's because we're bigger and prettier. It's we need something solider than that. Yeah, yeah.
Relate back to the same idea of phrase like what we would eat.
Yeah.
How absurd is that really? So, it's like you're going to eat a dog, but to an animal would be if connecting to it, but when it comes to pellets and say you're not like a vegetarian, then you're probably going to eat a steak or a burger. So
Yeah. Although we might end up with the conclusion here in the safety of the philosophy class where nobody's actually going to make policy based on. We can think whatever we want. Nobody listens to us. We might come to the conclusion that our policies are just all wrong. I think we should remain open to the idea that we come to some principled stance that says we're basically running all of society wrong. Not that you can do much about it, but let's at least remain open to that as an outcome that we could come to. Although you might not like it. We might consider that a downside of a theory if it tells you that everything you're doing always is wrong. But let's at least sort of keep it not off the table. Okay. So to sort out, so I think here's where I think we got. All right. So no cortex, no cry. I think this is a terrible argument. I think this is just a terrible argument. It's a terrible argument because multiple realizability is a thing. You can't say, well, it hasn't got this specific brain structure, therefore it doesn't feel pain. That's silly because it could be realized in many different ways. But that throws us into this question of like, oh God, so what do we do then? We can't look for pain receptors. We can't look for brains. We can't look for any of that stuff. Is it just behavioral now? What if they behave in radically different ways as well, but nonetheless have sentience? So it opens up a can of worms, as it were. Here's what we want. Here's what we really would like to have in this conversation. And this is Browning and Birch's thought as well. What you want is a scientific theory of sentience. You want a really clear theory of what it is, how it works, and then you'd be able to go find it in various forms. To be able to diagnose it in the world, it would be really nice to have a theory of its mechanisms. And we don't have that. We don't have that. We don't have a really nice, crisp, solid theory of what sentience is, what it's for, and how to diagnose it. That list that I showed you of criteria, those are rough criteria. Those are like, given what we know and what we think, here's the best we can do right now. And that's not me offering a criticism, that's what the authors say it is. The authors say, and one of the authors of those criteria is Jonathan Birch, and he says, you know what it would be really nice to have here is a scientific theory of sentience. And like, we kind of don't have it. It's not that we have nothing. We'll talk briefly about this before we finish off. We've got some leads. Never mind that slide. Here, I'll just give you the lead. Here's a pitch. Here's a proposal. Feinberg and Mallet, 2019. They suggest that consciousness, which is sort of, let's not talk about the relationship between consciousness and sentience. Let's pretend that that's not an incredibly difficult thing to trace out for the moment. What is consciousness for? What is it? What's it like to be? So I've sort of switched notions of sentience on you now to the broad one of like what it's like to be somebody. But for the purpose of this connection, I just want to say that there's nothing we can say about theories of sentience. So what's consciousness for? Why is it like to be Why is it like to be me? Why it feels like there's somebody here inside me. I feel like I'm a person with a point of view and stuff. Why is that? Why would nature have done this to us? Why would God and or nature have done this to us? And Feinberg and Mallet have a pitch. Here's what that might do for you. Consciousness might be a unified simulation of reality. So I have an experience of standing in front of you and saying stuff and seeing you and being in a space. All of these from like my senses, all my senses are and my background beliefs are all being organized in kind of simulation that I'm experiencing of my world. My conscious experience is a kind of simulation of trying to put together all my beliefs and sense experiences into a coherent picture. And that's a pretty handy thing to have because it lets you do things like think about what's important. It lets you plan things. It lets you imagine things. It lets you go through your memories and like check them against future beliefs and stuff like that. So having a reality simulation, you might call it. What if consciousness is a reality simulation? Your experience of yourself as a person is a model that your brain builds of your environment. And that's useful for a whole bunch of things, they suggest. Having a reality simulation lets you plan, it lets you remember in more detail, it lets you imagine, that kind of thing. And lets you narrow in on what's important, right? You can, having those motivational trade-offs depends on saying, well, this is more important than that. Well, how do you know anything is more important than anything else in a context? Well, you have some picture, the overall picture of reality. That informs any value judgment you make. Right here and now, this is the most important thing, and that's ultimately going to be grounded in your overall picture of what's going on around you, right? So there's a thing that a reality simulation might be good for, and then you can just go crashing around the history of evolutionary biology, looking for the machinery that would run a reality simulation. Probably need something like a brain. The simulation brings together sense experience and integrates it into a simulation. You probably need an integrative brain region. That integrative brain region's got to have enough machinery in it to both take in data and run a simulation and then respond to the simulation. That kind of stuff. So there's a pitch. Is that settled science? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's a proposal. What I'd like to advertise this what I'd like to advertise this as is a potential research program. This is a thing that you could look at and do incremental basic research on to maybe get towards a picture of what sentience is. It's not like a scientific brick wall that we can just never investigate, I would suggest. There might be complex metaphysical mysteries about qualia or whatever that remain after that. But in terms of figuring out which animals are sentient, that might be that's a theory. There are competing theories. We can test them. We can investigate that kind of thing. So it does make this kind of work kind of urgent in the sense of like making a bunch of moral and policy choices depends on the results of whether a reality simulation based on multisensory maps is what underwrites consciousness. Weird that that's what matters here, but it does seem to be what matters here. Okay. Which to say, we're not stuck. It's not that we can't investigate this. I do think there are quite reasonable pathways for investigating this, but we're not there yet. What Browning and Birch suggest is precautionary reasoning, which in the absolute broadest sense just means being careful in the face of uncertainty. Really, really rough formulation of precautionary reasoning is, in this context, is we should assume sentience until we have evidence of its absence. There are people in this literature who say, all of this, prove to me your sentience stuff is an evil way of framing this. We should assume sentience and not leave that assumption until we've shown that it's absent. So there are stronger and weaker ways of doing precautionary reasoning. Strongest version says act as though the harm exists until you're sure it does not. A weaker version would be like prevention of harm should be prioritized under uncertainty, but with some view towards the cost. So just in the example of climate, like the strong precautionary principle says we should act as though we are certain that climate catastrophe is nigh. The weaker version says something like, you should pay a lot of attention to the climate, but not like dismantling society level paying attention. Like if the conclusion is we have to like all stop eating or something like that, that's too much. But we should nonetheless pay attention to it. In the case of sentience, strong precautionary principle would be, in fact, a radical dismantling of society. Every time you plow a field, thousands of insects are killed. Every time you use hand sanitizer, millions of single-celled organisms are killed. Look at this from the perspective of plants. We are lumbering monsters that burn corpses to keep ourselves going. We shouldn't, if if all life is equally sentient to us, maybe we shouldn't exist, frankly. We kill a lot of it. For humans to exist, we kill a lot of other living things. So, full-on, strong precautionary principle, immediately assume that all living things are as sentient as we are until we can prove otherwise, kind of means we have to stop being here. Maybe something weaker is justified here. Maybe something with respect to the cost to the ones who are making the decision would be a reasonable approach. I'm not going to stop existing personally. I hope you all join me in continuing to be humans and hang around. So yeah, the strongest version of precautionary principle is wildly radical here, and certainly is not going to make it into any policy proposals anytime soon. No. The kinds of things you can do are, in some sense, the kind of things that the ASENT project helped to enact. So the ASENT project actually did spur some changes in the United Kingdom's legislation. So they have this animal welfare bracket sentience bill was expanded to include cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans. So that's kind of cool. So they actually started offering some legal protection to like octopi and lobsters and shellfish and stuff. Yeah, like people still eat them, to be clear. You can still order lobster in England, but the way that they're transported, the way they're handled, and the way they're killed got a little stricter in terms of what you're allowed to do. So this seems reasonable to me. That seems like a measured response, at least. Anyway, do we want to do this? I guess so. Just if you're wondering where we are here and now, in Canada, animals are broadly considered property. Their point of view is not a legal fact. It is unnecessary to cause, quote, unnecessary pain, suffering, or injury to an animal or a bird, but they don't say what's necessary. Sometimes going to the woods and shooting them for fun is considered reason enough. Hunting animals is perfectly legal in Canada. You can do that. Yeah.
And that's the stupid question.
Yeah.
Why do they separate animals and birds?
Animals and birds. I have no idea. That's not a stupid question. I spent like 2 hours trying to figure that out. No, I really did. So the question of so there's some animal protection laws, you're not allowed to make them fight each other to the death for fun. You're not allowed to have sex with them, both of which seem very good laws to me. But like, the degree to which they're protected seems to be correlated to the degree to which they are somebody's property. You don't hurt service animals and don't hurt police animals for sure, because you'll catch a federal charge. I guess go shoot a duck if you feel like it's fun to do that. Wild animals not being owned by anyone get vastly fewer protections. But sorry, to speak to this, yeah, I spent like 2 hours trying to figure out cool, okay, so which are the animals? You're not allowed to just torture an animal in Canada. That's unnecessary pain and suffering. That's illegal. If one of the like 3 animal protection officers in Ontario will come for you. We have shockingly weak animal welfare laws in Canada, but they apply to animals. I'm like, okay, cool. So which are the animals? And I went through the legislation, trying to find some definite. If you read legislation, very often the key terms are defined in some way. They say, for the purpose of this bill, by this thing I mean this thing. Animals are not defined at any point. And then they say, I noticed this as well. Animals and birds. Like, wait, birds aren't animals? What are the animals then? Don't tell me it's Kingdom Animalia, because these tardigrades are Kingdom Animalia, and nobody's protecting those guys. I have no idea what they mean by animal. Are mosquitoes animals? They're part of Animalia. It's radically the main concept of animal welfare law is nowhere defined in Canada, at least in Canadian legislation. Canadian federal legislation is not. It's not mentioned. So, yeah, I just thought that was bizarre, and I briefly, a couple of good news things about animal welfare and law in Canada. 2024, BC amended the family law to include pets as family members. So like who the dog spends a lot of time with can be relevant in, say, a divorce proceeding. Like if the dog's really attached to one person, that becomes a factor rather than like the TV isn't like attached to anyone. That's treated as property. The dog at least is considered a family member in some sense. We banned cosmetic testing in 2023. There's some discussion about banning captivity of elephants and great apes. Cetaceans, dolphins and whales, I think, are already, you're not allowed to keep them in captivity. So that's where we're at. So it's not that it's getting worse, but Canada has really, relative to the international standards, some pretty weak laws on animal protection. Just FYI. Anyway. Okay, quick questions before we're done today. Yeah.
What would you consider the lettuce?
I think it's stuff with a face. I really think that they only consider it stuff with faces, probably just mammals. That's what I suspect. It's the only thing that they've ever mentioned or done anything about. So, yeah. Okay, that's it for this time. Next time we'll do Hindu environmental ethics. Thanks, everyone.